welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stavroula Savelidis. I am the Executive Director of the Nassau County Medical Society and the Nassau Academy of Medicine. Our program today is called Coloring a Quarantine, Social Distanced and Vaccinated World for Children's Understanding. The goal for this panel today is to first honor our wonderful participants and moderator on this Women's History Month for all their accomplishments, but also to gain a deeper understanding of what has motivated our authors and illustrators to utilize their creative abilities to shape children's understanding of the pandemic and vaccinations. Just some logistical information before we dive in. If you're not speaking, put yourself on mute to avoid any background interference. At the end of the discussion, we will be opening it up for any questions. You can either raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your question directly, or you can type your question in the chat box. The Q&A will be managed by our staff member, Alexa Cover. Our moderator for this evening is Joanna Troyanos. She is a Master of Science in Education candidate in the School of Psychology at Queens College. So welcome, Joanna.
Thank you.
I'll get us started with the bios of our wonderful panelists, and then Joanna will just take over. I'll start with Erica Argos. Erica was inspired to write Why a Mask, You Ask during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Her mother-in-law and co-author, Kelly Argos, is a third grade teacher. The idea for the book started during a brainstorming session to help young students understand why a mask is important. The book has helped many young kids realize that wearing a mask is a good thing and doesn't need to be scary. Erica Argos currently resides in Southern California with her husband and son. Her second children's publication, Mommy Will Be Back, was written to help young ones understand the concept of daycare with the goal to ease the pain of separation anxiety. So welcome, Erica, and thank you for being here today. Bibi Knolls. Bibi Knolls is the mother of a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old and has a PhD in social psychology. When a Shot Meant a Lot is her first children's book. Bibi Knolls and illustrator Ray and Shea share an interest in diversity and inclusion and develop the gender-neutral main character so that all children could see themselves in the story. Welcome, Bibi. Thank you for being here as well. Emily Lodley. Emily lives in a little town in Oregon. After graduating from university, she began her teaching career. Emily excels as teaching our younger generation and gets just as much enjoyment out of seeing her students develop as she does in raising her own 2 children. She enjoys spending time with her family and their dog and cat. Emma's Marvelous Mask is her first children's book. She enjoyed creating this book, conveying important messages, which she presents in a fun and memorable way. Welcome, Emily. And last but not least, Rayanne Shea. Rayanne Shea is an experienced graphic and web designer with content expertise in health advocacy. After graduating from Emory University with a degree in anthropology and human biology, Ray worked in the healthcare tech industry, lived in Botswana for 2 years as with the Peace Corps, and currently is working at Global Health Strategies as a manager of creative. This is their first time illustrating a children's book, but they are excited to bring health education and representation to storytelling for kids. So welcome, Ray. Joanna, take it over.
I'm so happy to. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of who I am, as I'll be asking you all the questions. I am an MS Ed candidate in school psychology, and I have a pretty extensive background working with children in both psychological settings and educational settings. So I feel really, really happy to be here and to be getting to know you and talking with you. So let's dive right in. Let's get started. So the first question that I'm going to pose to our panelists today is, what inspired you to create the book that you did? And if you had any, what experiences with children made you realize that this book needed to be written for them? So anyone, panelists, you can jump right in, unmute yourself.
I can go ahead and kick it off. So I was on my maternity leave when the pandemic began and the lockdowns began. And I think for me, just figuring out a way to talk to my, at that time, 3-year-old about what was going on was something that I was facing daily. And I wanted to capture some of the messages that I had been communicating with him throughout the prior year. I think on top of that, I was bored. I think a lot of us 6 months into lockdown, we're looking for new things to tackle and ways to feel creative and like we could contribute. So I think for that reason, I also wanted to tackle it.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing.
I can jump in next. I think I have a 2-year-old son, 2.5 now, but it was the height of the pandemic when I wrote the book with my mother-in-law, and she's a teacher, and we were kind of disgusted, I think, by all the politics around everything, and children are so innocent, and I loved just capturing that in a children's book that put the politics and all the drama aside, and just to help them understand that, didn't have to be such a scary time, even though it was scary for everybody. That was, I think, my biggest inspiration.
Yeah. So working with BB on the book was amazing because I had been working in health advocacy from a global health perspective, and there was just so much effort and money and time put into educating like the global health space and the population at large, but so little of that time was focused on children. And so it seemed like such an amazing opportunity to communicate these messages in a more like nuanced, kid-friendly way. So it was definitely like a fun challenge to tackle, but it felt really, really important at the time and still is important.
Hi, I mean, in my case, it was probably a similar situation as with other mothers on this panel. So the biggest source of inspiration and motivation were my own kids, because the entire situation felt very abstract to them. So I felt like would be a great opportunity to create something that translates the entire situation and the safety precautions into a language that kids can understand and that they can relate to, which in my opinion works the best with a storyline and illustrations attached to it. That's how the idea of the book arose.
It sounds like there was a lot of shared themes in your answers in terms of just educating children on real world topics in a way that they could understand developmentally. And that's through the illustrations and through the storyline and in a way that they could conceptualize. So that brings me to my next question, actually on illustration. What role did illustration play in your books? And when parents are reading these books with their children, what are you hoping that they might see or feel, and how do the illustrations play into that?
I can jump in first. For example, in my book, I had a hidden character of a turtle, and a lot of kids have really enjoyed that piece of it. I think for me, it was just to, again, kind of keep it light and make it an exciting topic that they could get excited about and maybe share with their friends. And just to kind of take the pressure off of all the heaviness around the pandemic.
To kind of offer some lightness to the story that they're reading.
I mean, maybe I'm biased, but as an illustrator, the illustrations were extremely important to just like bringing life to this story. And BB came up with the narrative ahead of time, and then bringing these concepts to life was so much fun. So there's this one scene in the book where once everyone's on lockdown and they're not leaving their house, the little kid celebrates their birthday with a bunch of stuffed animals around a table, and you don't really get that full scene in the text. And so like seeing it next to the I think it says like, I forget the exact words, but seeing that like illustration of the kid sitting with its little stuffed animals and they're all wearing like the party hat was so much fun to illustrate. And I think those are the moments that like kids really get drawn in and they can use their imagination to have similar experiences during lockdown.
Right. So it's also about using the illustrations to translate the message that you want them to gain from that, and also, making it fun, making it something that they can be really captivated by.
Yeah, I'll add that Ray did a wonderful job putting in a few Easter eggs for adults. So I think when lockdown began, there's a scene in the book where as the child's looking at their tablet watching television, like their dad's walking by holding like a caseload of toilet paper. Something else we did to communicate how long lockdown had gone on was at the beginning of the story, there's a puppy, and throughout the story, it turns into a giant dog. And that's because, lockdown went on for a long time in many parts of America, at least.
So it's also about connecting with adults too, right? Because if the adults are engaging with their children in the stories, you want the adults to also be having a good experience in that bonding moment with their child where they're both relating to something at this.
So in our case, which is the Emma's Marvelous Mask, we were after really cute and vivid illustrations to transfer a feeling of positivity and like give a hope and reassurance that everything will be fine in the end. That's why also the main character, it's a really cute little girl, and most of the time she's happy and smiling, because when the kids are looking at illustrations, they should feel at ease, and there shouldn't be anything that they are scared of. So that's the part where Basma Ahmad, my illustrator, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, did a wonderful job.
Mm-hmm. Right. So developmentally, you know, you want children to be able to identify with those emotions during such a complex time when, you know, as you mentioned, there are politics going on and there's a lot of like big topics that even adults, like even as us, were having trouble understanding and really navigating. So those illustrations definitely help with the emotional component too. Okay, so I'm going to go on to my next question. So in terms of your narratives, which all of you've mentioned a little bit to this point, there is this theme of isolation kind of being a main issue, but then also that reunification piece as the ultimate goal. How do you think community and friendship might act as motivators for parents to get their kids vaccinated?
I would start on that one if nobody wants to. So I think there are plenty of reasons for parents to get their children vaccinated. The community that you mentioned and being able to come together again, and that's in a real life and not just virtually, it's probably the strongest motivator of all of them, because that's something that kids have been missing badly all the time, and that's essential for their health, for their development. So I think that's one of the strongest reasons, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'll second that. Connection with others, friendship, family is one of the most fundamental human needs. And it's such an odd situation to be in where that kind of basic connection was something that we really couldn't experience. So I know I personally looked very much forward to getting vaccinated and getting out of lockdown and reconnecting with others. And I think especially over the course of the last year, before Omicron picked up, you know, we got to see the benefits of vaccinations at scale, of people being able to reconnect for the first time in quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's really about that, being able to connect on that almost that very human level. Right.
And to bring it back to that same scene, the birthday scene, with the kid sitting around with the stuffed animals at the end of the book, I won't give away the ending, you'll have to read it yourself. But at the end, there's like, you know, our book came out right after vaccinations were approved for the older population. So the general population hadn't been vaccinated yet. And at the end, the kid sort of is like envisioning the future where they're able to be with their friends again for their next birthday. And it's so relevant because even though it was sort of like a narrative specific to that time, it's really relevant to talk to kids about the gravity of what the lockdown was and what it could be again in the future if we don't take those public health measures seriously.
Right. So it's giving children, you know, that sense of this is what this allows us to do. This is what being vaccinated and getting together and connecting allows us to do, but it could happen again. So this is what we should be prepared for. It's really, you're really reaching them at this level with like the story and the illustrations for sure. In terms of commercials and, you know, maybe other media, commercials have really urged adults to get vaccinated and wear their masks, and children will undoubtedly feel more represented by the children in these books that you've created. And so what fears do you hope that these books might dismantle, and what do you hope they will empower children to do?
I would like to add sort of a story. When we were developing the book, the final text of the book, in an earlier version, the child was saying like, oh, why are there all these shots on TV and why is everybody so excited about it? And the parents kept saying like, no, 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 you should be excited. This is great. And the reality is, and you probably know this, we aren't supposed to negate children's feelings, right? We're supposed to meet them where they are. And so one of the things we did as the story evolved was help them understand that it's not unusual to be afraid of getting a shot, and that that's a fine set of feelings to have, but that by overcoming that fear and actually getting vaccinated, there are a lot of benefits that we can all experience. So I think for me, part of it was, to your point, meeting kids where they are developmentally, and accepting that to a little kid, hearing about getting a shot is not necessarily good news, even though we as adults might feel that way.
So in your particular story, you're really focusing on validating these children and where they are and the emotions that they could be having and letting them know it's okay to feel this way because it's a very unpredictable time right now. So it's giving them that power to feel the emotions that they have and also cope with them at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it's something that's sort of lost on adults. You know, for us, it's like, oh, vaccines, that's great. But to a little kid, that can really be very scary information that they don't want to talk about. So being able to present it to them in a way that's approachable and sort of narrative oriented, as someone else mentioned earlier, can really sort of soften the blow of that conversation.
I just want to add a little story to this whole thing. So I did like a little experiment. I have a 12-year-old and he's scared of needles, deathly scared of needles. So I had him read the book to younger kids. So we had this 12-year-old read the books to younger kids. And I found it very fascinating, the interaction that they had with another kid that they wouldn't have with an adult. And they went into this whole conversation about, were you scared? Because he got vaccinated. So he had got both shots and it wasn't easy for him to do that. So it was very brave of him to do that. And he kind of talked to the little ones, we're like 6, 7, 8 years old, about, you know, you shouldn't be scared, but if you are, it's okay. You know, and this is good for everybody, but you get it when you're ready to get it. And like, you had this whole, it was the cutest thing ever. And I wish I had recorded it because it really just took this home for us, this whole process, and how it's important to validate your feelings. And I think as adults, sometimes we forget that. We know what the end game is. We know how we have to get them there, but it's the process, their story of getting there is what we sometimes have to work on.
Also with adults, it's a scary time for adults too, right? So, I mean, you're focused on keeping the children safe and keeping your family safe, and you just want to get X, Y, and Z done in order to have some sense of normalcy again. So it's hard. I think, you know, what everybody's talking about is right. You know, it's hard to remember that children have their own emotions about what's going on too. So absolutely.
I'll just add, I love that as a mom, I think we all know sometimes our children learn more from their peers than they're willing to learn from us. So I think that's a huge piece of it too, just the strength in numbers, and if everyone else is doing this, I can do it. I think that's so important, especially in such a crazy time when they're learning about death and things that we don't want to be teaching our kids that are so little. I think that's really valuable. That falls back on that community piece a lot too.
Mm-hmm. So offering a sense of normalcy, and that, you know, this is what everybody's going through right now, and it's okay to feel a little afraid of everything.
I also think that through storytelling, and I think maybe you kind of touched on this before too, that, you know, the pandemic was so focused on adults, but through these books, they were really kind of able to see themselves in these stories and, you know, getting through this really difficult time.
So this is the last question that I'm going to ask. In each of your books, older members of the narrator's family set an example of what we must do to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. How does that translate to the role that we adults should play, maybe moving forward for the children in our lives during any major health crises?
I can jump in on that. I think a big piece, our kids look up so much to their grandparents and older people in our families, and those also happen to be the people probably the most at risk with the virus, you know, with underlying health conditions and comorbidities and all that going into it. So I think, to bring those characters into the books is so special, because kids are like, oh man, if my grandpa can get a shot, I can get a shot. Or if he can wear a mask, I can wear a mask. I think kids, maybe even more than we realize, see that and are so proud of that, and they want to make their family proud. So I think that's a huge piece.
So they're role models. So in some way, maybe we can act as role models for the children who are reading these books and relate with them on that level.
I think the word role model, it just really resonated with me, because as you mentioned, as a parent, you are definitely a role model to your child, because the child looks up to you. So I think that's super important in the times of crisis, even if I really hope that's the last one we witnessed, is to stay calm and to stay balanced as much as possible. Like, try to stay that safe harbor for the kids, because when you are calm, the kids sense it and stays calm as well. So be that role model with taking care of your mental health and staying balanced, staying calm, and just showing what's right to protect yourself, to protect others, as it used to be the case, or still is, with the social distancing, wearing masks, washing your hands.
Right. From a developmental perspective, children are extremely perceptive. They watch everything you do. I mean, I think you hear these stories about children who, repeat words in schools that, parents might not necessarily want them to be repeating. And children like to tell stories, and they're imaginative, and they create their own kind of environment from what they see. So I think it's really important to emphasize, like, we are role models and children are watching what's going on. And so to offer this information to children in a way that they understand, and can help them understand, the adults around them too, I think is so important.
Yeah, when we were finally able to get our first vaccines, my husband and I, it was sort of a last minute. LA Dodger Stadium has open appointments. Anybody who goes can get one. So we threw our kids in the car and just drove straight there. So they were with us when we got our first shots, and we made a big deal about how both this hurts, but also it's good, and we do it anyway, and we're excited about it. So I think bringing them through some of those steps along the way can also be helpful.
And I'm sure when it came time for them to also receive their shots, they kind of they understood the process. They're like, oh, okay, so this is what mom and dad did, so we're gonna do it too.
My oldest son goes in for his next week, so I'll let you know how it goes.
Oh, great.
Well, it
One
is
story-
important. Sorry, go ahead.
One story I'll share is during the process of drawing and creating the book together, we got feedback from kids, which was really fun to watch. We had their parents like videotape it as they were reading through like early mock-ups of the book and their live reactions. And a colleague of mine, her daughter is very scared of needles. Like, it's something they talk about a lot. And as they're reading the book at the end, so our story, just for context, is about the grandma getting vaccinated, but it doesn't really talk about the kid getting vaccinated in the future at all, because at the time we didn't even know that was going to be a possibility. So this little girl read the book to her little brother, and at the end she said, what about the kid? What about the kid getting vaccinated? That wasn't even like an intentional message, but just to your point about role models, I think the immediate next thought was, if the grandma's getting vaccinated, what about me? So just a nice story to share.
Right. It's like, I want to do it too.
Well, just to add to that, my son got his at his pediatrician's office, and like I said, because he's scared of needles, he was also very embarrassed, because in the waiting room, there were like children of all ages, and most of them were younger than him. And so when he went into the room, like, he was getting very, very upset. Like, you could see he was working through getting it. And the whole time he was talking out loud and saying, these kids are here to get vaccinated. They're here to get their checkups. And I have to be brave because they're listening through the door. And if I can't have a mental breakdown here, so it is the role models are everywhere. And,
Yeah.
you know, in his instance, he was role modeling for these other kids who were like looking at him, like he came out all like brave, and he's like, whew, that was nothing. And he like made a statement. And it was like, it was priceless. But it is important. And actually, some of our pediatricians that are part of our society talk a lot about just the mimicking of the behavior. And, you know, when the children come into the office, what the adults' reactions need to be. If an older sibling is getting the vaccine before the younger one, or whatever the case might be, that it's important to set up that you know, that scene in a way that it's going to end up being a positive thing for them at the end of it. And for, you know, right now they'd have to get 2. And it's like, okay, you get the first one, you're not done yet. You got to go back again. So it is a process for them to, like, you know, get there.
Yeah.
This is probably the biggest thing they're going to do. Like, they feel very empowered now because we've made such a big deal of this. So they're doing their part.
Mhm.
And I'll second your point that role models are everywhere. I have an adult writer friend who read When a Shot Meant a Lock before it was published, who's terrified of needles. And he said in reading this book, he really felt comforted and encouraged that he should go out and get vaccinated, partly for the point you're making. It's like, oh, if these little kids have to go out, or, you know, just considering what a child would be going through, he's like, gosh, I really need to get it taken care of. So he's now fully vaccinated and boosted, I'm happy to report. So.
That's great.
It's like reverse peer pressure, being peer
Yes.
pressured by
Right.
the children.
Role models are everywhere.
Yeah, children are very resilient. And so I think when they have the appropriate role models and when they know what's expected of them and what their expectations are, it really helps them to process everything. And, you know, if we give them these tools to empower them so that they do understand, they'll be much more likely to bounce back, even though it is a scary experience. It is a process.
All right, with that, I just want to say thank you to the panelists for such a wonderful conversation. We're going to open the floor up for a quick Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box or raise your hand and I will call on you.
I can ask a question while we're waiting for others. Are you all working on, I'm assuming you're all working on other projects. Can you kind of talk a little bit about anything new? Or I know I read about one of them that's in the works. Anything new that we would be good for us to know that you're working on? Or maybe not. I know when I work on a project, I keep it to myself until it's ready to be like released. It's like, I don't want to jinx it. I'll let you know when it's ready.
So
Yeah,
just as a,
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
I joke that when people in lockdown would ask, like, oh, did you pick up any hobbies? I'm like, no, I've got 2 little kids. I lost hobbies. So I continue between having 2 little kids and a full-time job. This was after this project. That's all for now. I'm gonna take a break.
Absolutely.
Just as a second question, are there any books that you all have read that really impacted you, either when you were younger or that you've read with your children that you noticed had a huge impact on them? And what was that like?
I'll go. So my 5-year-old started pre-K for school for the first time this year after being home in lockdown for the prior year. So in prep for his transition to being in school out of the house, one of the books that we got is awesome. It's called We Don't Eat Our Classmates, and it's about separation anxiety, but it's done with fantastic wit and beautiful illustrations that are, it's really a funny book. So it talks about, you know, going to school for the first time, but it's told from a dinosaur's perspective. So it's both got great lessons for the kids, but it's got really funny humor for the adults as well.
I'll have to check that one out. I don't know about the rest of you, but I find myself just noticing illustrations in every book that my son reads now. And I'm like, I wouldn't have chosen that, or, ooh, that's really cool. You know, I'm much more hyper focused on that piece of it because I don't have any talent when it comes to illustration. My publisher offered that, but I just think that's such a neat piece of it that I knew nothing about. And kids love color and animals, and I think that's a really special part of children's books.
Yeah, I'll second. Something I notice about my kids' books now is some of the feedback we got when we were developing When a Shot Meant a Lot was to use varied language. And one of my other favorite books, they use the same verbs throughout the entire book, and now it drives me crazy. They're very odd. It's shambled is one of the verbs. I'm like, what is this word that you've chosen to use consistently throughout the story?
On the topic of language, I have my MFA in creative writing. So something that I noticed that a lot of you do in your books is you use rhyme a lot. And I'm wondering what that process was like in terms of like, you know, using rhyme to kind of entice your young readers.
I don't recommend writing a rhyming children's book. It was a horrible choice. So when I started, I'm like, oh, I'll take a stab at rhyming. And boy, oh boy, did I come to regret that decision. Because even if you come up with words that rhyme, getting the rhythm and the cadence of rhyming correct in a way that doesn't drive adults crazy is very, very challenging. And I think there were a couple of lines in the story that we really had to work to fit. Like, we knew what we wanted to communicate, but it had to rhyme with a small subset of words. And then I was on a rhyming dictionary website looking for some word, whatever it would rhyme with. And one of the words happened to be immune. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can use the word immune and it rhymes in this sentence perfectly. Jackpot, you know? So although I think it does create sort of a whimsical rhythmic feeling to it, I would say it's extremely challenging to do well. And I now have great respect for children's books that rhyme.
Absolutely.
I agree with that. Both of my books are rhyming, and I remember I'd wake up in the middle of the night and be like, oh, this word rhymes with that word, you know, and I'd be all hung up on something. And yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said for children's books that don't rhyme in a lot of ways. And there are so many that do. I think if they don't, it's really unique and kind of special in that way, for sure.
I can totally relate to this. This was super challenging to make the book rhyme. I didn't expect that. But it's just nicer to read out loud to the kids. It takes a lot more work.
Absolutely.
I also feel like it's somewhat limiting. I like this When a Shot Meant a Lot is in English, and if it had not been rhyming, I think it would have been easier to create translations of it. But now I feel like if we translated it, we'd want to do it in a rhyme, and that's obviously much more challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that language plays a huge role. And, you know, the rhyme scheme obviously intrigues younger readers to want to read the book again and again, because they just become so familiar with the way that the rhyming sounds. Are there any other questions from our audience? Joanna and Stab, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in as well.
I actually do have a question. I wanted to know if there was, you know, something about your books that maybe you would have liked to include, like looking back on it. Like, is there any like other messages you hope come through that maybe you weren't intending to in the beginning when you first wrote it? I hope that question made sense.
Well, nothing that can't be addressed in a part 2 book, but I think it was so challenging writing about the pandemic in the pandemic, because, and specifically about vaccinations, because literally we'd like, to all of your points about how hard it is to rhyme, we'd get the text down and then it would be like, breaking news, vaccines are now available to yada, yada, yada. And we'd have to like think, how does this change our storyline? And even like publishing it, we're like, this needs to be published right now, or else it's not going to be relevant in a month. And I mean, I think one thing that's really cool is like the story is actually very relevant, even beyond just COVID-19, vaccinations in general, and then also just like connecting the bigger picture of why we follow public safety measures and why we, you know, get vaccinated, and all these conversations, like they can be broadened. But I think one thing that I would love to tell the story of, like, to see that story of the kid actually going forward and getting vaccinated, and what it's like to get the second dose and things like that, because our story ends right after the first dose. Oh no, after the grandma's fully vaccinated. So what would it be like for the kids to be having conversations about vaccinations, or just following the pandemic on beyond that point?
I think I sense a sequel in your future for your book, ladies. I was just gonna say I struggled with scope too, you know, of because my idea was in March, right in the very beginning of 2020, and you know, it was like, do I want to call this a COVID book, or do I want to make it about pandemics in the future? Heaven forbid we have another one. I mean, I think that was a huge unknown, especially for those of us writing it early on, because I mean, even now we don't know what's going to happen. So I think it's pretty brave to just jump in and do it, and you know, hope that it is relevant for as long as it can be.
I feel happy that we were able to keep all of the narrative elements that we wanted to include in the story. What I would have loved to have done is spend more time on putting in Easter eggs for the adults in the illustration. So, you know, we have the one great scene where the dad's carrying the toilet paper, you know, across, but there were so many shared experiences during the pandemic that we really would have loved to have woven throughout the entire story. But, you know, you just have to Ray's point, we had to get it out before, you know, vaccinations became irrelevant or something absurd.
We do have a question in the chat box. It says, do children's books have genre? Do you follow those categories, and what are those?
There definitely are genres of children's books. We partnered with this app called Caribou, that is like a tablet. If I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a tablet service where you can basically like create a relationship mostly with grandparents as who their target audience is, but you can like play games with the tablet or read books together, and it just creates a more like shared experience virtually. And that's where I learned about the different genres of children's books and how cross-cutting they are. I mean, you could go into health, you could go into like, now there's specific categories for pandemic books. One that we really focus on is like representation. That's now a really big category that to feature books that have diversity represented in their characters and things like that. So definitely yes. I don't know if anyone else has other like genres that I don't know, like more like drama or comedy that they know more about, but definitely categories in terms of like the themes represented in the book.
If I could jump in for a moment, I work in 2 different sites right now. I'm at a preschool for 2 days, and I'm at an elementary school for 3 days throughout the week. And at the preschool level, we do a lot of book reading. In my counseling sessions with students, we do a lot of book reading, and I've seen so many different types of psychological difficulties tacked on with books and stories, because those are really complex. And so to kind of introduce that social emotional learning, they have so many books about problem solving and anxiety and difficult feelings, but also like the happy feelings too, and like when it's appropriate to feel happy and when it's appropriate to feel sad and process those emotions. So I don't know if it's necessarily one genre, but I know that those are a lot of topics that are addressed with children through storytelling, which we could have a whole other conversation about that.
Anyone else want to jump in and comment on this?
I just want to add that I totally believe that there should be follow-ups, obviously, to these books, because obviously this pandemic, now hopefully endemic thing we've lived through, it's touching upon other areas. You know, like here in New York, they dropped the mask mandates in schools. So, you know, we're dealing with a lot of fear. A lot of children they are still wearing their masks at school. Although the mandate went down, a lot of the children still don't feel safe to take the masks off. And just in talking with other parents, most of us are leaving it up to them and saying, listen, if you don't still feel safe, you can go ahead and wear the mask still. But just know that this is where we are right now. And I do think there's value in more books like this to be written, because the story is still evolving and it's moving now into a different direction. We're also dealing, because I have some friends that are teachers that are also dealing with bullying and, some families are telling their kids, COVID isn't that bad, don't worry about it. And then you got the kids that are, on the other side where the parents are very careful and very cautious and whatnot, and what it's been doing in the school setting amongst the children. And so I do think that there's, as with everything, this is it's like a living organism. It evolves, and it will need to evolve, because these topics will need to be addressed, because there are consequences to this pandemic. It's not only what we were living while this was happening, it's also now the aftermath, which is going to be, I think, more long-term than I think people gave it, the appropriate attention at the time, because we're dealing with the now. We weren't so much caring about what was going to happen a year from now or 2 years. It was like, now, let's get out of this now. And so, and our children are seeing this, they're sensing it, and they're living it in their own little microcosms of their friends and, school and other activities. And so I do definitely think that, there's so much more to be written. So, definitely a lot of opportunity out there for more stories like this.
One of the challenges that we had after the book was published actually was that figuring out ways to get it in front of the right people has been especially challenging, because to our sort of dismay, we discovered that Amazon, Facebook, and Google, none of them would allow ads for our book because it contains the word vaccine in the title, because it was considered controversial material. So even though it's in line with CDC recommendations for people to get vaccinated, we found that the big tech companies would not allow us to advertise because it was considered controversial. So just, I don't know, a fun fact about how advertising works nowadays.
That's so interesting. I had the same experience, with the mask book. Like I tried to drop it off at a few local kids stores, and I had a woman say, no, that's controversial, I want nothing to do with your book. And I was just trying to drop her off a copy and meet her face to face. I will never go back to her store. But I think it really opened my eyes to really how polarizing the topic was. And it's like, this is for kids. I didn't have any ill intention. I was trying to help children, not piss off parents or make a political statement. I think it's pretty interesting to try to navigate that with kids and how to help them understand it when it is so controversial.
And that's one of the things I'd also like to sort of revoice for all the doctors who are listening. I think because vaccinations and the pandemic broadly have become so polarizing, I think I would imagine many doctors have come to a place where they might not feel a lot of empathy for parents who are skeptical about the vaccines. But I think it's important to remember that all parents love their kids and want what's best for their kids, and that we need to be willing to hear their concerns and meet them where they are, to share the evidence with them, and hopefully, have an open dialogue that creates a sense of trust and perhaps ultimately leads them to vaccinate their children. So I think just remembering that although we believe and know that vaccines are good, that not everybody's there yet, and that we need to approach that with empathy and not sort of derision.
Absolutely, because there's levels of vaccines too. I mean, you have to remember that we've got, and this is speaking from the medical community now, that we have people who are anti-vaxxers just by belief. They do not believe in vaccinations, period. It's got nothing to do with COVID. It's got to do with all vaccinations. So those people are very difficult to really debate or speak to or educate, because they're not hearing it, because that's their stance for their own reasons, whatever they are. And, doctors a lot of time talk about the fact that we don't even try. When it comes to these things, you don't even try. But the people that they're focusing, that most of our pediatricians we were talking to, that they're focusing on are the skeptics, the people who are open to it, but just need more information. And in some instances, to your point, they just need more time. Up until now, I don't think the general public took the time to learn about vaccinations and how they get made and what they consist of and all of that. All we all knew was, in order for us to go to school, we had to have these 10 vaccines, or you couldn't go to school. Our parents took us to the doctor, we got the vaccines, we went to school, and that was basically the conversation you ever had. And now us as parents pretty much did the same thing. We might have done a little bit more research, maybe because it's a different time, but we did the same thing. And I think, you know, the pediatricians that right now are dealing with this is that they're saying that it's more about education right now. It's about letting them know what the latest studies are saying, what's happening, where we are with, you know, how strong it is, and, you know, how helpful it's going to be, and that there aren't any side effects, you know, and things like that. And, you know, you can never say never. There's side effects to everything. You could take an ibuprofen and you could have a side effect. You could take, you know, something very mild and you could have a side effect. Every person reacts to things differently. But I do know that our doctors have been dealing with this, obviously, from the beginning. But the moment the vaccine was available to the children is when all hell broke loose. And it's been a very difficult task for them to not only be providers of medicine, but also educators. And I don't know if they were all prepared for that. You know, it's like, okay, now I have to go into a different realm, because your patient is the child, but the parent is the person that you're dealing with. And so it has been an evolving process. It has been a very difficult process. And I actually told them about, obviously, when we're talking about this panel, and, you know, I suggested to many of them that they should have these books in their waiting rooms for parents to be able to look through and read through, because it'll help the children, it'll help the parents too. So.
Yeah, and to bring it back to children, I don't have kids of my own, but I can very vividly remember like soaking up different political views as a kid and not politicizing them. And I grew up in Florida, so it was a very like purple state, and like everyone at school was talking about all types of things politically, and I would come home and like challenge my parents, but it didn't feel like controversial, you know. I really just remember soaking up different messages, and something that my parents might see as like someone being a loose cannon and sort of going off, I would just see as an adult, an authoritative figure sharing knowledge and like sharing their perspectives, and kids are so curious and soak that up. So I do think it's really important to like remain open when talking to kids about these things as well, and try to avoid being super political about it, because once like kids are associating, you know, health messages to politics, like that gets into a little bit of dangerous territory.
Absolutely. And just to kind of circle back to the backlash that some of you've gotten about these books, it just truly shows how powerful these messages are. And that is why you're getting that backlash from the public. And I think a really good question to kind of end things on is, what role do you think storytelling has played in the past with this pandemic, and what role do you hope it will continue to play in the future?
Okay, I'll go. Well, I think we all know that, you know, I think the CDC in particular has really struggled with how to message around this pandemic. And we can really think of that public health messaging as a form of storytelling, right? But when we think back to the very early days of flatten the curve or crush the curve, like that's a very powerful narrative that really communicated to everybody all at once, very succinctly, what the goal was and why we were making such strong sacrifices. So although we now have a lot more information, which can make messaging more complex, you know, that narrative then was very effective at driving that message home. And hopefully in the future, our public health officials will continue to figure out great ways to communicate through narrative what we all need to be doing and why.
And I would just add that to that a shout out to all the doctors who are listening, because I think it's been such a crazy, challenging time. And it's one thing for me to get a little bit of backlash on a book about a mask for kids, but I have no concept of what that's been like to deal with that and have to quarantine from your families. And so thank you to all the doctors. I think they got in for a lot more than they bargained for when they went to med school, having to deal with the pandemic for sure.
And I don't think it gets said enough, but I want to just give another round of applause to the parents who got their kids through this pandemic. For me, it was one of the most challenging experiences of my entire life. And I know I'm not alone. I've heard a New York Times podcast about it, but we should all really feel good that we got through this together, and be proud of what we've accomplished, and, you know, keep on keeping on.
Absolutely. Are there any other closing remarks? All right, with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us. This recording is going to be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you again and have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
Bye.